Welcome everyone to today's webinar. I'm Emily Rapley with Becker's Hospital Review. Today we will begin the webinar with a presentation, and I will leave time at the end for a question and answer session. To submit a question, please type it into your control panel in the space labeled Enter a Question for Staff and click Send. We look forward to hearing your questions. Additionally, in about a week, we will send you a copy of the presentation to the email you used to register. At this time, it is now my pleasure to start today's webinar by introducing our presenters. Tapan Shah has more than 15 years of experience in the healthcare space, driving product and service strategy. He is passionate about topics driving clinical and operational efficiencies to support patient care and financial initiatives. His global experience involves product portfolios of areas including the interventional suite, operating room, intensive care, telemetry, and medical surgical. His current role with Cardinal Health focuses on driving strategic efforts and working closely with customers to solve their unique supply chain challenges. Prior to Cardinal Health, Tapan spent 11 years with Philips in various roles ranging across multiple functions like engineering, quality and regulatory affairs, product management, pricing, channel management, and marketing. He has held leadership responsibilities in driving customer relationships and business development roles ranging from patient monitoring systems and clinical alert management to both diagnostic and interventional cardiology solutions. I'd also like to welcome Suzanne Champion. Suzanne has more than 30 years of clinical experience in the perioperative setting. Since joining Cardinal Health, Suzanne has consulted on national and international accounts for inventory management, clinical processes and practices, preference card management, and supply chain management. Prior to joining Cardinal Health, Suzanne gained experience at both teaching university hospitals and community hospitals. In her clinical management roles, she was responsible for departmental planning, organizational effectiveness, and staff development. She was accountable for driving results that included fiscal and quality improvement activities, OR IT system building and optimization, supply flow efficiencies and cost savings, and inventory reduction. Tapan, I'll now turn the floor over to you.
Great. Thank you, Emily, for the lovely introduction. And thank you to the audience for your valuable time today. We really hope that you find this hour with us today informative and both meaningful. With me, I have my colleague, Sue, and we are both excited to be here today and share our own perspectives and experiences. So let me start by saying I'm sure you can agree that there's a ton of stuff going on in the healthcare space. And we're talking about reducing waste, the cost pressures for U.S. providers facing currently and also coming up in the next few years, and then the need and the overall push for driving inefficiencies out related to that, right? So from my perspective, clinical and operational efficiencies has been a passion of mine, just like Emily said. I love to be in the healthcare space, and I've been in the space for 15 years. I'm specifically passionate about those challenges that have a direct impact, not just on the financial piece of it, but also on the patient care aspect of it, right? So today, we hope to share with you some of our experiences, as well as understand how we have helped hospitals or providers, your peers, solve for some of these challenges. So just from an objective perspective, let's get started here. Over the next hour, we'll focus on three things. The first is understanding those common challenges faced both by the clinical and the supply chain teams. Then we're going to focus on the best practices to manage the related workflows for the supply chain and clinical folks, and the steps to achieve buy-in from the key stakeholders. And the third one is around capturing critical data and leveraging it for some proactive management of supplies. In the process, building trust with the clinicians themselves, all right? So just a little bit about Cardinal Health. We understand healthcare is complex, and helping customers solve all those complexities, that's our top priority. Many of our customers know us as a leading healthcare partner in solving for their supply chain challenges. And we're proud of our strong foundation. While it has been a backbone for more than 40 years, we are also very focused on building for the future of healthcare to encompass more of a broader focus, both on the services side, product side, business side, keeping the patient in the center of our mind, right? Add to this, we also have an extensive clinical team, close to 2,500 clinical folks with a variety of backgrounds ranging from both pharma to neuro. And this is a valuable asset for us because it allows us to solve for some of the most critical challenges and bring a clinical perspective in, so it's an outside-in approach. Their role is not just for clinical training, but also more on the product development side of the world, right? And Sue, being one of them, is here with me today, and she'll share her perspective. Let me just talk about it at a macro level before getting to the challenges that you see on the screen. I think at a macro level, we all can agree that we have immense pressure, revenue going down. The shift is happening from inpatient to outpatient environment. Expenses in general are going up. There was a recent publication by, I believe it was Forrester or McKinsey, showing how the revenues are going down and there's a crossover of the expenses going up. Physicians, what we're seeing is weighing more and more on the financial piece of it. And then what we're seeing is technology adoption. I don't think in the 20 years, the adoption has grown at the pace that we've seen in the last 2 to 3 years. And the only thing I would say about technology adoption is that it's only good if it's adapted and least disruptive to the clinical workflow of the folks who are using it, right? Our traditional way of solving for these expenses has been focused on more labor and product costs. How can we drive labor down? How can we, squeeze costs out of the product itself? And we have not taken the opportunity to explore and look at supply chain as an opportunity to help with some of those expenses and driving some of the revenue. So let's dig into some of those challenges being faced in today's supply chain. At the highest level, this was a study done by GHX. It's a quantitative study done by GHX. It was published by Modern Healthcare, titled as Losing Preferential Treatment. But it shows you that in 2013, when the survey was done, there was a estimated $5 million of waste that hit the supply chain each year. And what's more surprising of that 30% of the waste was being affiliated to physician preference items. Now, we're not talking about physician preference items going away. Let me be very clear. It's about how to be effectively managing those physician preferences. Unfortunately, this waste is driven not only by medical device companies, like you can see on the gray charts, to the contributors, but also providers, hospitals as well. You'll see that a lot of contributors on the bottom, ranging from loss and expiration to revenue leakage, as well as own inventory not moving off the shelves as quickly as it should. Okay, so what is this waste attributed to? In most cases, it's simply poor inventory management and also the workflows related across the supply chain itself. Okay, I'm sure that number has probably only gone higher, I can only presume. But additionally, what I want to focus on is that fact that doesn't just focus on the hard costs that you see on the chart. Let's not forget about all the soft costs or indirect costs that are on the right side listed for you, right? We're talking about miscellaneous labor, product recalls, time spent locating products by clinicians before they hit the patient, and then I can't put a price tag on non-compliance to audits by the FDA, compliance with UDI regulations, or liability that comes from inserting an expired or recalled product into a patient. I think you all get it, right? So what I'm going to focus on is now drive down a layer below to understand what this impact is to the feet on the ground. Okay. So Cardinal Health released a survey conducted actually by Sermo just last year, asking critical questions as it relates to supply chain, but had clinical implications as well. I'm going to dig in deeper in some of the findings here itself, right? I'm not going to read all of these. You can probably see it on the screen. I'm going to pick on 3 that intrigues me the most, and every time I see those numbers. Starting from the bottom left second, 20% of clinicians' work weeks are spent on supply chain management. That baffles me. Clinicians didn't go to school to do supply chain or inventory management, right? They went there for patient care. Right next to it on the left, 7 to 10% of clinical products in a hospital expire before they're even used. What a waste, right? And even if they end up on a patient, that's probably the worst thing you want, but you want it off the shelf. It should never reach the patient, but it should be off the shelf, proactively managed, right? Top right, all the way in the first row, 49% of hospital frontline providers, that's your clinical staff, believe paperwork and patient care focus as the most stressful things. Clinicians, again, should be focused on patient care, not looking for products, not spending time doing documentation. I can't tell you how many times I've been in a hospital and I watch a surgery, whether it's in the OR or in the CV space, where the physician comes in, is done with the surgery in 15 minutes, and the cath lab tech or the OR circulator is still sitting there doing documentation half an hour later, right? Just a waste of time on trivial tasks that can be automated or can be worked on efficiently. When asked, so this is another survey, this is part of the same survey, we asked a few questions and I want to share that in a little more detail. We actually, as part of the survey, asked, what is the single biggest problem facing the organization? And by the way, these questions were not the supply chain folks. These questions were the supply chain leaders. These questions were the clinical leaders and frontline users. and these were also the hospital administrators. So it was a good mix of 3,000 respondents. When asked what is the biggest problem facing your organizations, I think we can all expect, financial concerns and reimbursement in top of mind, just given all the stuff going on the macro level, from revenue going down, expenses going up, right? But what caught my attention was staffing, which is highlighted right here. I'll get to that in a minute. We go to the next question that you see up there is, within your area of responsibilities, all these stakeholders or all the folks who took the survey, we asked them, how important is your organization's supply chain in addressing these challenges to achieve your goals? And nearly 90% indicate that the hospital supply chain should solve for this, right? What this means is that hospital leaders really feel that supply chain should solve for these challenges, okay? We all know staff satisfaction has a direct impact to the quality of care, and supply chain has a unique opportunity to be part of addressing those challenges for the clinicians. Again, I'll point your attention to the bottom graph where it says frontline, right? Frontline are staff and patient, and supply chain, these administrators, these leaders in the hospital, these clinical folks in the hospital believe that supply chain can play a critical role. And we'll get to some of that in a minute. But what we see today, and I'm sure you can agree, there's always exceptions, but I'm sure you can agree in general, that the roles and responsibilities of supply chain and the clinical teams can not only be very siloed, but also sometimes gray, as it relates to who does what. How many have seen their clinical teams counting inventory or hunting for a product to simply ensure that they have what's needed to take care of the patient while they're in the procedure room, right? Valuable time wasted on trivial tasks from inefficiencies in value chain. And I specifically call it value chain, not supply chain, because I think it is a joint effort required both from the clinical and supply chain folks. You can't just blame supply chain inefficiencies for all of this. It's also in the communication aspect, there's a trust aspect here. But the reality is the gaps are real. So we'll take a bit deeper look on what they look like, and I'll hand it over to my colleague Sue here and give her a clinical perspective. Sue, you want to take it from here?
Sure, thanks, Tapan. That's really great data that you've shared. Now, I would like to break it down a bit on what I've experienced, not only with my clinical hat when I was working in a facility, but also what I have seen firsthand now working with Cardinal Health. The biggest thing that you said, it is a reality that information is siloed and that successful collaboration between departments is still really a challenge today. And when that happens, when you have siloed information and you have that collaboration that's just not clicking the way it should, what you have is a lack of inventory visibility and incomplete data. So let's look at it from the side of the materials management. Why do we have these silos today? Well, with materials management, their focus really is to adhere to a budget. We all have budgets, but materials management, their biggest task is to adhere to that budget and maintain the supply efficiency and ultimately have more of a financial focus for the institution. That's the reason that they're there. But at the same time, they understand that they really do have an impact on the clinical patient focus. But that is not their most important focus at times because, once again, their goal is to be focused on the dollars. So then you turn around and you look at the clinicians, whereas their number one focus is providing quality patient care in a timely manner while achieving that positive outcome that is so critical. It has always been critical, but it's even more so today because there are financial impacts designed directly towards that positive outcome for the patient. So when the clinician's at the bedside, at that point, the farthest thing from their mind is the cost. They have to assume at that point that everybody has really done their job, that everything, the components will be there, their supplies are there because they are there at that patient bedside. And for the clinicians out there, I think you really understand what I'm talking about. Your patient has just come into the room. You've transferred them to the procedural table, and your technician is setting up in the background, and all of a sudden, there's a component that technician has to have. So what happens? Technician is scrubbed in. They're not going to take off their gown and glove to run and get that supply. It's that nurse, the clinician, the provider that's at the bedside with the patient. All of a sudden, that patient gets moved off to the side a little bit, and the focus is once again on supply chain and going after those components. That is not an unusual scenario, unfortunately. We see it all the time. But there is a shift beginning to occur. Health systems are recognizing that there should be a role that not only has a direct focus on inventory management, but also the metrics should be tied to clinical and financial impact. This role oftentimes includes somebody with a clinical background that has experience on the clinical side, but also understands the business financial side. If you look at that one statistic down there, 23 billion, what does that represent? 23 billion is spent less by top performing supply chains that engage physicians to standardize to the use of an implantable device that's proven to have clinically equivalent outcome, yet it is at a lower cost. This role helps to build the confidence and the trust that's needed for that successful collaboration, and it cements the entire team, resulting in better outcomes all around. Now let's pause for a poll question. What interferes with your ability to provide patient care? Is it staffing shortages, fluctuating supply levels, inefficient workflows, or the communication gap between key stakeholders such as clinicians and supply chain? We'll take a few minutes to look for your answers. Okay. And I see that most answered the inefficient workflows or communication gaps between stakeholders. And to tell you the truth, those are probably the top two on my list when I was working in a facility. The inefficient workflows, people doing things that really aren't in their responsibility gap, in their responsibility pool, or the communication gap between the supply chain and the clinicians. All of that causes friction and pulls everybody away from their focus. Now, in addition to these barriers, inventory management can also present its own challenges. So let's look at some of the barriers for inventory management. Before I dig into these pictures, let me tell you that the reality is 50% of hospitals today are still using manual processes to do inventory management. Think about it. This is 2018, and 50% of facilities still do it by hand without using automation. And if hospitals do tend to be using technology, it's a really basic technology such as barcoding, and that still requires manual processes. That is hard for me to believe in this day and age, but it is a reality. Now let's look at these pictures. If you look at the top left, this is a picture of a hospital's, an operating room supply area. And what we're meaning to show on this is that there are supplies that are very expensive, high cost value, sitting on the shelf next to other items that are more of a commodity level that cost less than $1, that are very small in the cost. And so when you have that discrepancy of the high cost dollar supplies on the shelf with other ones, it makes it very difficult to manage that inventory the way that you should. The top photo in the middle just shows that there is some communication gap and how they're doing it as a manual process for running their supplies. The one that really gets to me, the bottom left, that is a return area from the operating room. We were in this facility at 8 o'clock in the morning and that room was empty. This was a photo that was taken at 12 noon. So this is inventory that was pulled for procedures, then returned because they didn't need it. And that becomes a storeroom. That is a warehouse for inventory, and at times people have to go to that room to look for something. The picture in the bottom middle, this is the one that really drives me crazy. While you can see on the right-hand side of that picture, someone had written last one. That's how they're managing their inventory to know that the supplies are dwindling. Somebody manually had to write it. But the most concerning one for me is looking at on the left-hand side. There's a note on those products. Someone had put those products away and said, wasn't sure where they go, so I put them here. How do you ever find those? Those are the supplies that get lost in that virtual storeroom somewhere and nobody knows where they are? Now, what if they were one of those very important patient-specific items you were looking for, and all of a sudden they're not there because someone put it away where they didn't know where it belonged? How do you track that? How do you manage that? How do you know when you need to reorder? All of that pulls into all of that mess that we find in inventory management in a procedural area. Now, we've talked a lot about the challenges, both clinical and from a supply chain team perspective. Talking about it is great. You have to know what's going on right now. But now let's talk about how we can solve for it. Of course, while recognizing that you have a problem is the first step, knowing how to solve for it is really just as critical. And in reality, no matter where you start, you have to go back to the beginning. The story actually starts from the moment the truck pulls up to the dock. You have to involve the people that are at the very beginning, because that's the beginning of the supply chain. I lived in the operating room world before Cardinal Health, and now being able to see all of the procedural areas, it's the supply chain that ties successful clinical operations together. It really is much more than materials management. And success, the first part of success is really understanding that. So let's talk about the core areas that you focus on when you're trying to solve a problem. Communication. If a decision has been made to drive a process, then great. That's fantastic. It can be the best decision in the world and the best solution. But unless you communicate it and tell folks what you're doing, why you're doing it, and what you expect to see from the outcome, then you have a breakdown right at the very beginning. Then you have to understand the workflow. With your team closely reviewing the workflow, look at the current processes. Know where you are. I always encourage teams to walk the floor, walk from the receiving dock all the way to the point of use. It's oftentimes very eye-opening to see, and I've experienced it. Some of the things that we have found along the way would never have been discovered if we hadn't done the walk. And take the time to talk to people that you see along that walk. Make sure that you understand what they're doing, why they're doing it, and what their expectation is of their job. Stakeholder alignment. You have to define a cross-functional team to lead the process early on and ensure that there is commitment. Frontline management has to be committed in helping to enforce the change. You have to ensure that everyone on the team is an influencer at some point so that they can help drive the change and take the time to empower the team and to make sure that the change really gets cemented and frozen. Empower the clinicians and the supply chain to make the decisions, because without their buy-in and support, it ultimately will fail. It may work for a while, but it will revert back to where it was. And always make sure that you include the appropriate people on the task force. Include everyone that's impacted by the process, from, like I said, from the people at the dock all the way to the end user. Then you have to make sure that you circle back around and review what you've done and assess to make sure that it really has hit the parameters that you were looking for. You have to monitor the new process because it's very easy to fall back on the old ways. Ensure that there's no back doors or workarounds, because you know, clinicians, we are the original MacGyvers. We know how to come up with a workaround if it means that it will make our job easier so that we can focus on the patient. We'll find that workaround. So you have to ensure that the solution you have come up with doesn't impact that clinical workflow. And for a while, for the frontline managers, you really are a drill sergeant. It's not that people don't want to change, it's that they need to understand and embrace it, and they don't want to have their focus impacted and pulled away from that patient. And then continue to communicate the process. If you never hear about the changes that you've done and the positive outcome that's happened, then people will tend to want to revert back to their old ways also. And make sure that you truly look at and you're analyzing what you're trying to do. You always have to continue to re-review everything to make sure that it's still tracking. Things change in your facilities. So you shouldn't expect that a solution that was decided upon 18 months ago still is relevant today, because we know how fast-paced the healthcare industry is. Now let's take a look at a complete picture and how it came together for a hospital on the West Coast. This case study was conducted at White Memorial Hospital, which is affiliated with Adventist Health in Los Angeles, California. And you can see the actual results of a hospital that went from a very manual process to instituting an automated inventory management process using RFID technology. This was a 5-room cardiovascular department that included 2 cath labs, 1 interventional radiology, and 2 EP labs. And we studied the hospital in 3 phases. First, we captured the time the clinical staff was managing supply chain activities using the manual process, because you always need to benchmark where you are. If you don't know where you are, you cannot come up with a solution for where you want to be. You always have to start at the beginning, as I've said before. So then they instituted an RFID solution, and 3 months later, another study was performed taking on the supply chain activities post-implementation. You know, before the study began, there were a lot of pain points, which may be things that you hear or see or experience in your own world. There was inconsistent, manual, and time-consuming processes for documenting, ordering, storing, and replenishing supplies, everything that happens along a supply chain process. There was no easy way to locate or track expired and recalled products. There was very little supply chain visibility, and there were a million inconsistent workflows because everybody was doing it in the time that they had allotted and what worked best for them. Now let's take a look at the results. Within just 3 months of moving from an manual inventory management to an automated approach using RFID technology, White Memorial was able to see a positive impact to their bottom line from both a hard and soft cost savings perspective. You know, they achieved visibility to their inventory and eliminated a significant amount of product that was sitting on their shelf before it expired. Folks, that's critical. Think about it from a patient safety aspect when you talk expired product, but also from the financial aspect for the facility. Anytime that product is expired, what happens? We eat the cost, and we can't afford to do that. You know, cycle counting was occurring every day that allowed them then with the RFID technology to have a much greater control of their supplies. No more color coding to identify when usage should occur, because that was what they used in their old manual process. And reordering was much more efficient. The varying processes once used by the checks was eliminated, allowing for optimized par levels and peace of mind and knowing that the products they would need would be there when needed. So that statement right there speaks to both supply chain managers, but also to the clinicians. For supply chain, I'm sure your eyes lit up when you heard optimized par levels. And for the clinical folks, just the confidence in knowing that they had what they needed when they needed it. And the suggested par levels, ideal quantities were identified in just a few weeks after the install. Think about that. It didn't take months to realize the results. That happened in a few weeks. Look at those statistics on the bottom. 177 hours were saved in cycle counting per year. Now, I'm sure there's some of you out there that you have clinicians that are doing that cycle counting. Maybe they're not true material managers. So think about what you could do with that time that's given back to your folks that now don't have to do the cycle counting. 95% improvement in tracking expired product. That is awesome. I know myself, I was always dealing with expired product when I worked in a hospital, and it was probably the bane of my existence. Knowing that there's a solution out there right now that would help do that, oh my goodness, I can't tell you how positive that would be for me. And then look at this, the last one, $42,000 in initial savings from improved charge capture. And we know with the bundled payment, a lot of times, you know, you can charge all you want and reimbursement is what it is, reimbursement. But when you're looking at these specialized products, there truly is a need to be able to have that charge capture. And they had access to comprehensive, complete inventory data, and they could quickly pull reports. So as a leader in your department, when you're asked to provide a report to your leadership, to the upper management, to the C-suite, how good would it be that you would be able to pull that data and really have it at your fingertips so that you could give that report to your leadership to show what you've done and what the positive benefits are. And you dramatically simplify your workflow and improve the process overall. And if you improve the supply chain process, you inherently are improving the clinical process also. Now, I know it seems overwhelming to go through a transition like this, but you can see it really can be done. And the results are significant. They're not just results that look good on paper. They're results that really have proven in practice that there is a positive outcome for everybody. Now let's pause for one more quick poll question. What is your biggest concern to adding technology to clinical and supply chain workflows? Is it the investment? Is it lack of stakeholder support? Is it teams not adapting and embracing the new processes? Or is it the uncertainty of outcomes and benefits? Take a moment and we'll discuss shortly. Very interesting. The two that came up, 42% for the investment. And while it is a good financial investment, you have to look at what the outcome is. So your upfront cost really is taken care of by if you look at what the efficiencies it drives. The other one I just want to see though, 29% said teams not adopting and embracing the new processes. And we do understand it is really difficult to get people to adopt new processes. And for clinicians, I get it. You tell me technology and all of a sudden I start to get shaky about it at times because it does seem scary until you really know what's going on. I remember back in the day even learning how to use a computer in the operating room. I thought we would never get there, but look how far we've come. And the same would happen with a technology, with a solution that really drives to the outcome that you're looking at. So now we've talked about a process. Now let's look at some best practices to consider when evaluating the inventory management platform. Toppin?
All right, thank you, Sue. I have to say, every time I see those pictures you put up there, I think it's probably third or fourth time, and it always surprises me and baffles me. So I thought it was an interesting response on the survey for the investment piece and teams not adapting. So I'll talk to actually both of them. Let's talk about a little bit of technology and solving for these challenges. Technology has to be relevant to the use case you're solving for. I think the concept of one size fits all is not going to fly when you're looking at a solution and stuff, right? While there are many benefits to automating inventory management, the key is to understand that there can be variances between the types of automation and the processes that are offered today, right? So just like the checklist that Sue had covered on driving change, you need to ask yourself some critical questions. The questions would be, is the solution flexible? Does it work with your unique needs, right? You have some unique challenges. Has the vendor partner, the solution provider, taking the time to come in, understand those challenges, learn about you, do an assessment, and then recommend solution, right? Is the solution scalable, right? As you think about growth and leveraging the technology and the solution itself, does it grow with your health system as the health system changes? For example, if more rooms are added, you have new departments get adding, can it grow across the continuum in the enterprise side, as in, the CV space, the OR space, on the med search floor? Does it help scale across multiple sites if you're ITN or enterprise hospital provider? And then, is it interoperable? Right, we're talking about data here, and in this day and age, it's critical that valuable data is actually interoperable and can be bidirectionally communicated to your existing hospital information systems. So is it interoperable? And then while we're talking about data, the accuracy and usage piece of it to understand that is critical. As an engineer, software engineer, the first thing they taught us when we're doing database was garbage in is garbage out, meaning doesn't matter how fancy your algorithms are to calculate and put up pretty charts and visualizations up there. None of that is good if the data you capture is corrupt or is not accurate, right? So data accuracy is of importance. And then taking that data and doing something with it, with bite-sized information and to help you make some decisions, that's where analytics comes in, right? So let's talk about analytics itself. All right, and there was a recent study by Forbes. This is a visualization of one of the analytics screen around the usage, but the background here, the recent study by Forbes indicates that 66% of supply chain leaders say that advanced supply chain analytics are critically important to their operations in the next 2 to 3 years, okay? More than 2/3 of them. That same study also found that a majority of supply chain leaders have a sense of urgency for getting those advanced analytics implemented and contributing to their operations itself as soon as possible, right? Now, the term analytics can be broad, so I just have a sample screen here, but it's important to know what we're looking for and to ask the right set of questions. So some of the key questions you might want to ask is, can the analytics, right? I mean, when we define analytics, we said it's about informed decision-making. Can the analytics uncover some key trends? So do you have enterprise visibility to costs at all levels? For your department level, for your site level, right? Can you proactively identify savings opportunities you may have not considered before? So I'm talking now about understanding your utilization, understanding your power levels, optimizing that, but also using that to make some strategic purchasing decisions, all right? Does the analytics help you better demand plan so you can avoid stock outs and vice versa? You also don't want overstock, right? The opposite is also true. You don't want to stock out. How many times have I heard verbally from a clinician I've talked to that they remember a time when they have been yelled by a physician because supply was not available and they had to run around looking for the supply, right? Why does a clinician ever have to be in that situation? I think that's where supply chain can help prevent some of the situations. Does the analytics allow for increasing efficiency? You know, we talked about adoption. Well, clinical folks who will not adopt technology and solution if it's not easy to use, if it's not intuitive. What's the point of adding a technology if it just adds more steps and it becomes more cumbersome? Obviously, you're going to get non-compliant and the whole investment is going to go down the drain, right? And then from a patient safety perspective, supply chain has a unique opportunity. So the question you got to ask is, can you virtually eliminate concerns over expired or obsolete products? And I'm sitting on the item. You know, Sue was talking about the example in the case study and how she was cringing while she was talking, like, you know, always worried about having expired products sitting on the shelf. And it doesn't matter if it's purchased or consigned. The onus is on the provider to make sure the expired product is not sitting on the shelf. If it is, well, worst case, it should never end up in the patient itself, right? And then if you look at it from a strategically, supply chain's role has to shift more from a box mover, so less of a materials management role, to more of actually providing some valuable insights. Wouldn't it be nice if supply chain can provide data around understanding cost per encounter? That would be awesome, right? Wouldn't it be nice to actually understand physician utilization? We talked about making strategic, bulk buy purchases. And, when I started and kicked off this webinar, I talked about, showed the data on the waste and talked about physician preference items. Again, we're not talking about getting rid of them. We're talking about how can you effectively manage them. I don't think you'll ever get rid of physician preferences. It's about how you effectively manage them, right? And you have the right set of tools. And I think that's where analytics comes in to help you with that. So these are some of the key questions you need to ask if the solution you're looking at, does it provide all these capabilities itself, right? So measuring success for me is the ability to look at total picture. I'm not going to read on the bullets on the left. I think it's visually, you can read it from the screen itself. We talked about most of these in the previous slides. What I want to focus on is really on the right side of the screen, right? Which is looking at the 360 of it, the full picture here. Yes, everybody can come in and claim when I'm reducing waste and bringing cost levels down. I've heard providers saying, hey, vendors coming all the time talking about ROI, and I see these, ballooned up numbers, 200%, 500%, 700% ROIs. There are solutions out there that can help you reduce waste, but you got to look at the broader picture. Does it help streamline the workflows? Excuse me. Not just from the clinical folks, also for supply chain, right? In terms of tracking and managing and documentation of those critical supplies. Does it safeguard your patient? Yes, supply chain can play a critical role in safeguarding patient on those initiatives, right? They can prevent expired products and recall products from ever sitting on the shelf or being pulled out on time, right? And at the center of it is operational clarity. The golden rule is you can manage what you cannot see. So you need to have the visibility. And you know, if you're at a VP level role or you're managing multiple departments, you know, as a clinical director, multiple departments, multiple sites, you need to have that enterprise visibility. You need to know what's going on, and it should be real time. Only then you can manage effectively. So, right? So one of the questions, one of the responses to Sue's question, last polling question, was around investment justifications, right? So we have to talk about measuring ROI, and that's usually the number one question. So what to look for in an ROI, right? Like I said, every vendor will come in with an ROI. The question is, do they understand your challenges? Have they assessed you, understood your unique challenges, understood the problem at hand before even pitching you the ROI? And at the end of the day, it's your ROI, right? And that's why it's important to understand the situation. Now, ROI means different things to different people. It could mean a different thing for a clinician versus something else for a supply chain person. On the clinical side, you know, the ROI could mean having the correct product available when it's needed. So it's all about right product at the right place at the right time. It could also mean efficient and accurate way to document all the data to capture the supplies for the case, right? So that could be an ROI for clinicians. I'm not saying they don't care about the financial aspects of it, but that probably is on top of the list when they're talking about it. And when I say right product, we talked about expired and recall products, never ending up on the patient side, right? At the end of the day, the platform needs to be easy to use, and that's where the adoption comes in, so you can get better compliance. And more importantly, what we're here for is that clinicians need to start trusting on the supply chain, and you don't ask for trust, you earn your trust, and you do that by using the right solution to drive some of those efficiencies and be involved in the strategic decision making. Now, on the supply chain side, the ROI could mean areas for more meaningful inventory reduction, more strategic bulk buys or purchases, improving a way to drive charge capture. The example you gave around 42,000 Sue at White Memorial is an example of, actually impacting revenue or reimbursement, right? Directly by catching those gaps. Visibility across the supply chain with clear data and analytics to drive some critical decision making. So, right? Okay, and finally, when this is all put together, we need to understand what is the impact that supply chain will have on the clinical team. So this is our concluding slide here before we get into Q&A. When put together, this is how a successful supply chain team can enable clinical operations. First and foremost, identifying an inventory management solution or supplies management solution that will result in a more quick and efficient, simple process, not just process, but also workflows, not just for the clinicians, but also for materials managers, right? It gives clinicians more time to focus on patient and surgical teams, right? Supply chain, I think people can argue, but I think at the end of the day, we can all align on that supply chain. Our biggest customer is our clinical staff, the folks on the front line. So we have to enable them to provide the, better patient care. And the way you can do that is kind of take away all the trivial tasks from them and automate some of the things so they can focus more on patient care. We talked about patient safety aspects, right? The ability to proactively identify expand and recall products impacting patient safety directly. Strengthening cross-functional alignment. This is the big 5 letters, right? Trust. Owning that trust, communication gap, filling in the communication gaps. We were actually at a healthcare supply chain summit in New Orleans 2 weeks ago, and in the roundtable, consistently across, the big institutions, 11 of them, and consistently they talked about how supply chain is actually earning the trust by, getting involved in more strategic decision making, and they do that by just driving a stronger awareness around process and utilization and pricing. So supply chain is now part of the value analysis committee. They're sitting in those committees and bringing valuable data. Wouldn't it be nice if supply chain can do that at all the institutions, bring that relevant data and input so effective decisions can be made when pulling out when you're discussing in the value analysis team. Discussions on product standardization or process standardization, both understanding based on understanding physician utilization, giving input into, hey, which products we can kind of narrow down to if the clinical team is going to make that decision, right? So there is a lot of opportunity for supply chain to bring in valuable data and input and play a little more strategic role than a traditional box mover role. Well, I hope this was helpful. I thank you all for your time today. And Sue and I would be now happy to take a few minutes and answer some of your questions.
Thank you, Tom and Sue. That was a fantastic presentation. We will now begin today's question and answer session, as Tappan mentioned. A quick reminder to our audience, you can submit any questions you have by typing them into your controls panel in the space labeled "Enter a question for staff" and clicking send. We'll try to get through as many questions as we have time for today. So let's go ahead and get started. Our first question is, how do clinicians react to this type of approach to inventory management? Sue, I'll let you kick this one off.
Okay, thank you. Well, you know, the solutions that I talked about in this webinar are very well received by clinicians. Now, that's not saying that there's not some trepidation in the beginning, because there is always a change management period. And clinicians, we do tend to be a little bit wary of what's going to happen and how much more work it's going to involve for us. But once they have seen this solution and realize that they can focus on what they really need to be focused on, and it does take the worry of supply management away from them, then they really do embrace the solution. And as I mentioned earlier with White Memorial, that's a great example of how a hospital made the change and is seeing great results. And also they're seeing those great results from a staff satisfaction perspective also, not just the financial impact or the supply chain impact.
Okay, so there may be a brief transition period, but then the solutions are received positively. That's great to know. So for our next question, how easily can the solution interface? Tappan, this is a great one for you.
All right, thanks, Emily. I think it just kind of goes back to the slide I was presenting on interoperability. The solution itself, we interface using industry standards. So technically, you know, HL7 or similar industry standards that we can work with to interface. We can make it happen. We have a list of, you know, we understand interfacing is not just to a specific system, it's multiple systems. So when we look at interfacing using industry standards with HL7 or broader, we're looking at interfacing with materials management systems, so you like the PeopleSoft and Lawson's, talking about interfacing with the HEMO systems, right, the Philipses of the world, the GEs, the Mergers of the world, talking about interfacing with EMRs, the Epics and Cerner's of the world. We're talking about interfacing with the billing systems. We're talking about interfacing with ORIS systems that you have in your hospital. So we can interface using industry standards with most of these systems. And like I said, you know, interoperability is good. Data is only good if it can be shared across bidirectionally. That way, you know, we can make the clinical person's life easier in terms of not double documenting and introducing any wasted time or in errors itself. So the long story short, we use industry standards to interface, and we've interfaced with multiple hospital information systems that I just mentioned. Emily?
Thanks, Tappan. That was really helpful. So let's move on to our next question. We've got an audience member who wants to know a little more about patient safety. Sue, can you tell us a little bit more about the impact this solution can have on patient safety?
Sure, I can do that. You know, patient safety, a big part of it for patient safety are the medical devices and the implantables. They play a major role with that. And as we said, I don't know, we mentioned it quite a bit because it is so important, the expiration of the product and also the availability of that product. That has a direct impact on patient safety. And solutions like a RFID solution really helps to manage that. So it takes it out of the manual hands and the people that are hoping that they did everything correct within their process. So that allows them to really be able to see everything that they're doing and that they have the correct product and it's not expired. But let me take it more to the clinical level. Patient safety is directly impacted by the focus of the clinicians in the room. And if the focus of that clinician has to be anywhere but on that patient, you are directly impacting patient safety to the detriment. So a solution that allows that focus to remain on the patient because you can push away the supply management thoughts, that definitely has the impact on patient safety. And we're not just running it around and trying to drive to that. That is a true indicator for good patient outcomes, is that clinician at the bedside. And this solution really does allow for that.
Thanks, Sue. That was really helpful. So our next question is about best practices for adoption. We have an audience member who would like to know what the best practices are for adopting an automated solution once it's been launched. Sue, I'll let you take this one as well.
Oh, okay. That's a really great question. And as stakeholder support is critical to ensure that you achieve the results that you initially wanted to achieve. So supply chain teams are going to be worried about how does the solution impact the supply chain and the way that they manage inventory and do their cycle counting and all of those processes that are involved in that aspect of it. While you have the clinical team, they're going to be most worried about how will it impact my practice and how am I going to merge this new technology into my practice while still dealing with the patient. So you have to make sure that you have buy-in from the clinicians because they're the ones that are going to be using it at the end of the day. So they have to truly understand what it is that will be impacted by it and what the outcome will be, the expected outcome, but also ensure that there will be training for using this solution, that it's easy to use, and that it really does have a natural flow into your processes. So to gain adoption, I would ensure that you really have project champions that not only are advocates of the new system, but can also help with usage and compliance, and that it allows for everyone to understand the benefits. So it goes back to that number one that I had on my slide, which is communication. Make sure you are communicating what's going on and why, and then make sure that you, at the end of it, communicate what the results are, good and bad sometimes, because sometimes you find that, well, maybe we didn't get the result that we really wanted in the first shot, so we have to take a step back and maybe change a few things within the process. That's when you have that buy-in and the stakeholders truly understand that they are part of the solution.
Thanks, Sue. So it sounds like the key here is to really focus on getting that buy-in and support. Okay. So
yes,
for our
absolutely.
Next question, thanks. Toppin, this question is great for you. We have an audience member who wants to know who tags the products. Is it the hospital or the manufacturer?
That's a great question. And I'll actually tie in another question I see on the list there, which says, what are your thoughts on needing to manually scan items? Because I think both questions are actually asking around the manual effort required. So let me say, I think it's a long-winded answer because let me take a step back. I think if you remember on one of the slides, I said, you know, the technology and the solution you use has to solve for the use case or the challenge you're trying to solve for, right? So it's not a one-size-fits-all. If you're applying RFID tags on a $2 item, that's not the right way to use the technology, right? For that, you might want to, for those low-dollar items, you might want to manage it through a Kanban system, which is a Lean Six Sigma process. The important piece here is to make sure that you're managing high-value implantables, low-dollar items, anything in between, whether it's a process or a solution with RFID barcode or the Kanban solution, you want to make sure it's sitting on the same platform. So let me start by saying that. That way you have clear visibility across the entire portfolio. In terms of where the products get tagged, most of the manufacturers do tag the products. For those who don't tag, products are in the hospital receiving area, which can be, and that's where you can tag it. Once you've decided which product kind of categories you want to tag, that tagging process takes literally 2 to 3 seconds. The downstream impact of that, what it says, 80% downstream, is that what we need to talk about? The inefficiencies that it takes out by initial tagging, and that doesn't have to be a clinical person. It shouldn't be a clinical person doing the tagging up front. Probably is somebody you pay low-dollar wage, you know, X amount of dollars per hour for sitting and tagging and knowing how to use the software. But the downstream impact is so worth it for the folks who are managing inventory, capturing usage, and tracking on a day-to-day basis. So let me start by saying that. The question around thoughts on needing to manually scan items. I think when you're talking about supply chain and management of supply, you got to kind of, you know, put a divider where you talk. One thing is you're talking about inventory management. The other piece you're talking about usage capture and utilization. The inventory management piece of it, you can automate it using, you know, smart cabinets. There are solutions out there that reads it every 30 minutes, every 40 minutes, and you get automated read counts. A materials manager or a supply chain person or a clinical person never has to touch any of their products, right? They'll be sitting in these cabinets. So it's automated. They don't have to touch it if you're using the cabinets itself. In terms of charge capture, you have to scan the items, whether it's barcode or RFID, you have to, you know, scan it because you want to make sure you're setting up the case and those charge or utilization is being captured to the right case itself. So yes, there's just the scanning aspect of it. But again, taking back what is barcode or RFID or Kanban process, you have to kind of sit down, assess what is the right solution or technology for that specific type of product you're trying to manage and how you're going to manage that. So I cannot stress the importance of, the trivial task of just adding a tag up front for RFID products and the impact it has for everybody downstream when it comes to managing the supplies itself, but more importantly, having that visibility itself. So I hope that answered that question along with the tagging question. And I think that's all we had from a Q&A perspective. Emily?
Thank you so much, Tapan. That was really helpful. And I think that's a great spot to end the presentation today. So before we sign off, I'd like to thank Tapan and Sue. That was an excellent presentation. And thank you to our audience for participating today. Please enjoy the rest of your day, and we look forward to having you join us for future webinars.